Hey guys, thanks for tuning in again. Just wanted to give you an update on what's been going on with Iran over the past several weeks and during the summer. So first we just need to dissect what makes Iran Iran. Especially in the 20th century where they had heavy influence from Europe, mainly Great Britain, Russia, and the United States. So when you look at the big picture of studying one country, you'll see cause and effect time and again, hundreds, if not thousands of years in the making. So to really get the big picture, Iran's no different except for their oil influence. So I'll work my way from the early 20th century all the way up to the Iran nuclear deal and what's been going on in the coming weeks with Trump and with Iran. So let's get started. So Iran's been a Middle Eastern powerhouse for millennia. It has 82 million people, the largest natural gas supply in the world, and the fourth largest supply of oil. So say if sanctions were to be fully lifted, some experts say world oil prices could even drop by 10%. But due to its central location, these natural resources, different empires have ruled Iran throughout history, ranging from the period of antiquity with the Achaemenids, the Macedonians, Seleucids, Parthians, Sassanids, and later on the Qajars. So Iran's a Shia country, which puts it against the likes of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, who are predominantly Sunni. Contrarily, there are large Sunni, Shia populations in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Bahrain. So anyhow, the Qajars ruled Persia from 1795 until 1921, where they were overthrown by Reza Khan. So remember that name, Reza Khan. The Qajari rule was doomed by several factors, one being just territorial losses at the hands of the Russians, where Russia and the Persians fought a series of wars between the 17th and 19th centuries. So by the end of the wars, the Russians had the upper hand and consolidated modern-day Georgia, Armenia, Dagestan, and parts of Azerbaijan by 1828. So the oil-rich country of Persia had debt issues, whether it was just living lavish by the Qajars or overall mismanagement by the British. Mismanagement by the Qajars. It ultimately led to their final overthrow in 1921, which was supported by the British since they had offered the Qajars economic support for decades. So they would basically, front them a bunch of money. They would live lavish and just not pay back their debts. So the British supported Reza Khan in overthrowing the Qajars. So, when this happened, there was only one brigade of troops that was left in the capital city of Tehran. It was the Persian Cossack brigade, which it was a brigade that was styled after Russian units and trained by Russian officers. It was a cavalry corps. So they ended up overthrowing the Qajar Shah in 1921, and their commanding officer, Reza Shah, he was like an imposing 6'4" atheist. And he paved the way for a new government and installed himself as Minister of War. Though the Qajar Ahmed Shah, he did retain his power. He ruled as Shah, but he didn't really have much power. Reza Khan was able to install prime ministers of his choosing. But for a few years, a game of musical chairs was played where Reza Khan fought off some dissidents and tribal groups who were still fighting off the new change of government. But ultimately, Reza established his own dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, by constitutional assembly in 1925. So that's when the Qajars were finally deposed. This was the same Pahlavi dynasty that was the Shah that was overthrown in the 1979 coup. So they'll come up later. But anyway, many of those in the coup that were involved were either killed or put in prison. This was a time that I like to always point out too, where it was Reza Khan or Reza Shah who changed the name from Persia to Iran, which was land of the Aryans. Really, though, throughout history, it's been known as Persia, and they've been known as Persians. So I usually refer to them as such, and the terms can be used interchangeably. His son, Mohammed Shah, he actually said that you can use it interchangeably. It doesn't really matter to him. So I like to still say Persian. as opposed to Iranian. But moving forward, I'll be using Persian. So it's important to know, though, that it was the Qajars before Reza Khan took power who actually gave the British oil concessions in 1901. So before the advent of oil in Persia, one can find relative stability in leadership. There were 3 different dynasties being established in 420 years. So after oil was found, there were 4 deposed prime ministers and 2 deposed dynasties in 58 years. So that's certainly not a coincidence. So the Qajars allowed the mining magnate, the British mining magnate, William Knox d'Arcy, to negotiate an oil concession, and he assumed exclusive rights to prospect for oil for 60 years in a vast tract of territory, which included most of Persia. So in exchange, the Shah received 20,000 pounds, it's equivalent to 2.1 million in today's pounds, an equal amount in stock shares, and 16% of profits. So BP, as we know them today, they were formed in 1909 as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC. So once oil was finally found, it did take d'Arcy 8 years, though, and he actually almost gave up. Well, he kind of did. He sent a telegram to his team just telling them to pack up and go back to Europe, but they actually didn't listen to this order, and they kept looking, and then a few weeks later, they found oil. So it's actually a pretty interesting stroke of luck for the British and just for history in general, because had they not found the oil, who would have, where would we be today without that? So, as a result, though, once they found oil, massive amounts of investments flowed into APOC, what we know as BP. British government decided to become a controlling stakeholder. So here you have this foreign oil company just sucking up all the profit, basically derived from the domestic country's resources, and the British assuming that this will end well. Hint, hint, it won't. I will say, though, a deal was brokered and they were just simply carrying out the terms, be it as it may be. But anyhow, the poor Persian population was promised educational reforms and a meritocracy to be established by both the Persian government and APOC. Technocrats were discontent. They were constantly blocked by unilateral authoritarian state that was buttressed by Europe and its oil interests. This obviously didn't bode well in the coming years. So with the population, they constantly saw the British just meddling in their affairs. So predictably from our stance, further discontent arose once the British and Persians hammered out a new deal in 1933 that was quite unfavorable to the Persians. The terms extended the original d'Arcy oil concession by 60 years. It contained APOC oil drilling to 100,000 square miles, albeit, though, it was the best 100,000 square miles in Persia. So they got the best land, okay, and they extended it by 60 years. So this is already looking good. It required annual payments of Persian income tax, which was new, guaranteed minimum annual payments of 750,000 pounds to the Persian government, and exempted import or custom duties to APOC, all while disallowing Persia from performing audits. So they couldn't look at the books and see what the profits actually were. Clearly, these terms were widely agreed to have represented an unfair deal by the Persian populace, which makes sense. And to top things off, Persia surrendered its right to annul the agreement and settled on a complex arbitration process instead. So this is kind of like the Treaty of Versailles for them. It's like, what we can understand why they wanted to nationalize oil later. So we'll get to that in a sec. So on we move forward towards World War II. So the Anglo-Persian Oil Company continued its large Persian operations, although it changed its name to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to better reflect itself in 1935. They were basically just crushing the oil market, and they built a massive oil production facility in Abadan, and they continued to invest further into the country. So once World War II erupted, the British realized they had this massive investment in Persia, and they decided to invade Persia and protect their oil interests and basically set up their troops right where all the oil was being flown from, derived from. So they secured a supply route to the Soviet Union in order to stymie Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis. So the British, for the second time, meddled in with who was in power alongside with the Soviets this time, and they forced Reza Shah to abdicate the throne since they felt they could work better with his son Mohammad Reza, who would be known as the Shah that we all know that was deposed in 1979. So the new Shah was a Francophile. He loved French culture. He studied in Switzerland and loved Western ideals just overall. He spoke French to his children, for example. He would be a pretty decent Shah, but we'll get more into him in a sec. But by 1950, Persia had the largest refinery in the world in Abadan, and the British were just pumping the hell out of it because the recession subsequently after World War II, they were in a terrible recession, so they kind of needed this oil. So in 1947, AIOC reported after-tax profits of 40 million pounds or 112 million pounds in today's pounds. But the contractual agreement at the time entitled Persia just 7 million pounds. So that's 17.5 of the profits from Persian oil. So the British were receiving way more than Persia. So in addition, conditions for Persian oil workers and their families were horrendous. They basically were living amongst oil if they worked in that field. They had no roads, and they promised to improve them. So they're clearly just taking advantage of the situation in Persia. So by late December of 1950, the Persians received word that the Saudis brokered a fair deal with the Americans, where they'd receive 50-50 profit share from Aramco, which later became ExxonMobil. So Exxon was in the same position as BP had been with the Persians. So pressure from the nationalists began to boil over as a result. So here you have this weak, almost effeminate Mohammad Shah, son of this 6'4", military confident man, who's still relatively new as Shah and unconfident in himself. Apparently he was just really weak. He was really tiny. He always wanted to be tall. He would judge people on how tall they were. He had a gay friend he brought from Switzerland who was his bud. People suggest that they were together, but he was married, and people, throw out that was just basically the Khomeini and his people basically saying that he was gay, and that's one of the reasons why he should have been overthrown. But anyway, so as the Saudi news spread, discontent grew, and in March of 1951, the Persian parliament, the Majlis, voted to nationalize Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and its holdings. So they were just going to seize it and take all the profits. No more British intrusion. So shortly after, the Persian public elected a champion of nationalization, which was Mohammad Mossadegh, as prime minister. So that led to the Abadan crisis, in which, under British pressure, foreign countries agreed not to purchase Persian oil, and the Abadan refinery was closed. So BP or AIOC decided to withdraw from Persia and increase the output of other reserves in the Persian Gulf. So then they started trying to negotiate with Mossadegh, but talks broke off. The British then formulated a plan to intervene and capture the Abadan refinery, but ultimately Churchill and Truman opposed intervention. They instead preferred a coup of Mossadegh. It was basically cheaper. Before the war, before this was agreed upon, though, the U.S. actually made an agreement with Mossadegh, but the British believed Mossadegh would be overthrown anyway. This, however, was not the case. So he was wildly popular with both the left-wing nationalists and the right-wing clergy, and he had a wide base of support. So the British were able to take advantage of American aversion to communism. They hinted that in a possible communism takeover, and that large oil reserves would go to the communist interests, which also wasn't the case. So the U.S. then approved of the coup, and the coup was thrust into action by the commanding CIA officer, Kermit Roosevelt. So if you recognize that name, that was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, which is interesting enough. So he basically has been screwing us over the past, 70 years. So thanks, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. Anyway, The CIA just started bribing officials, local strongmen, newspapers, and they garnered support for the Shah. The British continued their pressure as well since they banned Persian oil, and it really hurt the Persian economy. So the Shah then issued an edict forcibly removing the immensely popular and democratically elected Mossadegh from power. General Fazollah Zahidi then rolled up with tanks to Mossadegh's house and arrested him. So on the 21st of December of 1953, Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement in a military prison. Prosecutors requested the death sentence, but Mohammed Shah prevented them. Mossadegh was then kept under house arrest in his residence until his death in 1967. So now the British and the Americans get what they want. They have a pro-Western Shah, a new pro-Western Prime Minister, Fazollah Zahidi. So now Persian oil began flowing again, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company then changed its name to British Petroleum, as we know them, BP, in 1954. And they tried to return to their old position. But anyway, so however, Persian public opinion was so opposed to the new government, to the idea that BP could kind of go back to the old status quo. The populace would not have it. So under pressure from the U.S., BP was forced to accept a membership in a consortium, aka a cartel, of companies which would bring Persian oil back to the international market. BP was incorporated then in London in 1954 as a holding company called Iranian Oil Participants Limited, IOP for short. The founding members of IOP included BP, Gulf Oil, which later became part of SoCal and Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell, and the French oil company Total SA. So the four Aramco partners, Standard Oil of California, SoCal, later Chevron, Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, Standard Oil Company of New York, later Mobil, then later Exxon Mobil, and Texaco, each held a 8% stake in the holding company. So in short, Americans, French, British, and Dutch all had oil interests in Persia post-1954. This group of companies of various stages became known as the Super Majors or the Seven Sisters or the Consortium of Iran cartel. They dominated the global petroleum industry from the mid-1940s to the 1970s. So until the oil crisis of 1973, the members of the Seven Sisters controlled around 85% of the world's oil reserves. So all members, however, acknowledged that the National Iranian Oil Company, or NIOC, owned the oil and the facilities in Persia, and it was the Seven Sisters' role to operate and manage them on behalf of the Persians. So similar to the Saudi Aramco 50-50 agreement of 1950 that was discussed earlier, the Seven Sisters agreed to pay, share profits on a 50-50 basis with Persia, but again, they would not allow any audits by the Persians. So these negotiations were clearly performed quite skillfully by the newly created Euro-American cartel. So after the cartel was established and terms were brokered with the Persians, oil began to flow again from Persia, but this time on unprecedented levels, and normalcy began to sink in. So the Shah envisioned basically this modern and progressive society for his people, somewhat similar to Europe. He invested his profits into educational reforms, allowed suffrage rights for women and equal opportunities, which was great steps for his country. With that all being said, however, though, Mohammad Reza Shah was considered pretty weak. Like I said, he was kind of a coward. He played off the factions of the elite and the Americans against the British with the aim of being an autocrat. The Persian elite were openly disappointed that the Shah did not conduct a bloody purge and hang Mossadegh, and his followers thought that he would, but he didn't. The Shah tried very hard to garner support of the leftist National Front by adopting some of their rhetoric and addressing their concerns. So he basically just started copying Mossadegh and all of his policies. And since he realized, okay, he's popular, maybe I should do what he's doing, he promised broad socioeconomic reforms, So starting in 1955, Mohammad Reza began to quietly cultivate left-wing intellectuals and embrace the image of a progressive Shah, a reformer who would modernize Persia. So everything was going pretty well. By the 1970s, Persia had an economic growth rate equal to that of South Korea, Turkey, and Taiwan. Many Western journalists all regularly predicted that Persia would become a first world nation within the next generation. So Persia was also performing very well in the auto industry as well. For example, by 1978, Iran National, ran by the Qajars brothers, had become the largest automobile manufacturer in the Middle East. One of the Qajars brothers actually said once that had it not been for the revolution in 1979, Iran National would be where, quote-unquote, South Korean car industry is today. So that's kind of sad. But anyhow, Mohammad Reza, he gradually lost support from the Shia clergy of Persia, as well as the working class, due to a strong policy of modernization and westernization, which conflicted with the traditional class of wealthy merchants and Islamists, of course. So he also had positive relations with Israel. The clergy didn't like that. He also had positive relations with the U.S. and the U.K. Couple that with corruption and a lavish lifestyle surrounding himself and the royal family, the ruling elite. He would have his lunches shipped in from France. That doesn't really look good when people are starving next to the parties that you throw. So he kind of got a little greedy and just, didn't really care about his population as much as he said he did. So he also enacted various additional controversial policies, including the banning of communism and Marxism-Leninism, which I'm okay with, but not banning it. You can't just tell people how to think. And then he effectively just suppressed all political dissenters through his secret police, Savak. According to official statistics, Persia had as many as 2,200 political prisoners in 1978, which, of course, a number that multiplied rapidly as a result of the revolution. So several other factors that led up to the revolution was just his ailing health, his cancer treatment. He basically was making poor decisions, and he was starting to clash more and more with the leftists and Islamists. So it kind of makes sense, really, as to why rebellion fomented. Here you have this pro-Western, somewhat effeminate tyrant who was installed by the U.S. and Great Britain, who opened up sexualization, westernization, and modernization in Persia, all while he reduced his country to one political party. He allowed only his political party afterwards. When I talked about the communists and Marxism-Leninism, he didn't stop there. So he suppressed all of his dissenters, and he alienated the religious Shia sect of his society. So this isn't going to end well. So by 1978, people were having mass protests, and he even had his troops open up fire on protesters when they told them that they're past curfew because they installed martial law, and he killed an unknown number of people. Some people say it was 88, some people say it was thousands, so we don't really know. But this incident was called Black Friday. So after that, it kind of started really twirling out of control. Ultimately by 1979, political unrest had transformed into a full revolution, which on January 17th, they formally forced him to leave Persia, which he later died from cancer complications in 1980. So the 15-year exiled Ruhollah Khomeini, who was exiled for his dissent against the Shah, returned and established the Islamic Republic of Iran. So he was famous for his clerical and political writings about Shia Islam and how Islam could be implemented into Persian law. And of course, his opposition, to westernization, the Shah, was pretty popular at the time. So the new political system, it had elements of presidential democracy with a theocracy governed by an autocratic supreme leader who is the highest ranking political official and religious cleric in the country. So although the Khomeini allegedly stressed that democracy was akin to prostitution, they kind of set up a little bit of a democracy. It's more so a republic, with the election of a president, but the Khomeini, or the supreme leader, overseeing the president. So the regime itself, though, it's been described as authoritarian. It's got significant constraints and just overall abuses against human rights. For example, I just read this week that they were about to put a woman in prison just simply for watching her favorite soccer team. She ended up burning herself to death in protest. There was also 3 women who were basically convicted in a kangaroo court where they couldn't even really defend themselves, and they were not wearing hijabs, and they convicted them each to around 10 years. But they say maybe they'll serve half, but we'll see. But in totality, I read it was 55 years between the 3. So anyway, immediately once these religious zealots took power, they purged the academia of any Western or non-Islamic influences to bring it in line with political Islam. And they banned things such as alcohol. They started vetting candidates and trying to determine whether or not if they were un-Islamic. And then they also began vetoing on un-Islamic laws. So Sharia law was introduced as well, with the Islamic dress code being enforced for both men and women by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and other Islamic groups. So women were required to cover their hair. Men were not allowed to wear shorts. Most Western movies and the practice of men and women swimming or sunbathing together were banned. As a result, the Cultural Revolution contributed to the emigration of many teachers and technocrats, and the loss of job skills and capital weakened the Persian economy. So also thousands of people who supported the Shah, they just faced firing squads and attempted to flee the country, but many of these were skilled people, so it really hurt the economy. In addition, they violently suppressed the Kurds in the northwest. They installed martial law when they asked for language rights, and then basically just started killing them as well. So in addition, just look at this whole country. It's starting to you have a lot of you're going to have a religious Republican government set up that's just basically purging all dissenters. Okay. So anyway, they also annulled the agreement with the Seven Sisters, and they nationalized oil, just like Mossadegh. It would seem that years of investment by the Americans and British all went for naught. The Persians simply took the oil fields. But if you recall, I mentioned that the Shah died while in exile, but before we get to his death, he still, let's imagine him still have cancer while being on the run. He first went to Egypt, then he went to Morocco, then he went to Mexico. He was basically moving all around, and the U.S. didn't want to take him in because we're realizing, if we take him in, there could be a bad thing for, not only the people that are at our embassy in Tehran, but just, Persians across the world might view that as negative for us taking them in. But anyhow, he was in Mexico, and he received poor treatment since he basically just failed to mention that he had cancer. Apparently he knew, though, years before because French doctors had told him. But, with his health severely declining, he was admitted reluctantly by President Carter at New York Hospital. It was like Cornell Medical Center. That was it. So Carter was warned by the State Department that this would probably result in a seizure of the American embassy in Tehran. So as predicted, this occurred once we took in the Shah, and it was known across the world that we had. This resulted in the Iranian hostage crisis, where 54 Americans were held for 444 days and ultimately released once the Algiers Accords were signed, where the U.S. agreed to the following terms. So the U.S. would not intervene politically or military in Persian internal affairs. The U.S. would remove the freeze on Persian assets and trade sanctions on Persia. Both countries would end litigation between their respective governments and citizens, referring them instead to international arbitration, namely the Persian United States Claims Tribunal, a body of international appointees. So also the U.S. would ensure that U.S. court decisions regarding the transfer of any property of the former Shah would be independent from sovereign immunity principles and would be enforced, and Persian debts to the U.S. institutions would be paid. So we did pay back a lot of that. The Persian populace apparently wasn't satisfied with the results, however, but the government holds an annual commemoration of the hostage crisis by burning the American flag at the embassy and leading a chant of death to America. But recently, however, there's been other chants heard apparently, such as death to the dictator in reference to the supreme leader. I don't know how much of that I believe, however, but I definitely can see the death to America part because that's pretty rampant. Anyway, diplomatic ties between the U.S. and Persia were broken off due to the crisis as well. So we weren't talking. We didn't have embassies. Anyhow, back to the supreme leader. Once Ruhollah Khomeini assumed power, he began calling for similar Islamic takeovers across the Arab world. Also consider that they're Persian, not Arabic. Persians speak Farsi. Arabic speak Arabic. So anyhow, he's calling for all these Arabic countries to basically have Islamic takeovers, and Iraq was right next door, and he began calling for them to have an Islamic takeover. They were also another country besides Iran with a large Shia majority population, and at the time, you can guess who was in power. It was Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein was a secular nationalist with the Ba'athist Party. He was also hopeful to take advantage of Persia's weakened military and what he assumed was just revolutionary chaos, and in particular just occupy Persia's adjacent oil-rich province of Kazakhstan, I believe, and to undermine Iranian Islamic revolutionary attempts to incite the Shia majority in his country. So basically, he's looking at this nice big old oil field. He's thinking, okay, if I can cut the head off this snake before it's too late and I'm going to be taken over too, I can just get that done. Two birds with one stone. So anyhow, in September of 1980, Iraq launched a full-scale invasion of Persia, which lasted until 1988, and it was one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century that people don't even realize took place. Persia was 3 times the size of Iraq, but it was unable to gain a complete victory, and the war just ended in a stalemate. Though it did importantly solidify the Khomeini's rule. Iraq performed pretty well in the war at first, since it was funded by other Arab states and the Gulf states. They also feared Islamic takeovers as well, as both the Soviets and the Western countries feared that as well, so they funded Iraq. The U.S. at first peculiarly supplied the Persians due to another hostage crisis in Lebanon, which led to the Iran-Contra affair, which mired the Reagan admin. So, long story short, we had the Israelis sell arms to Persia. We resupplied Israel with the sold weapons, got the cash, and hoped to release the hostages held by Hezbollah. So ultimately, we began to fund the Iraqis, though, for obvious reasons. But the Persians, however, did have plenty of stockpiles that were left over from the U.S. supplying the Shah's dynasty. So regardless of the Iran-Contra affair, they still had a bunch of bullets and weaponry that we basically had previously given them. So anyhow, the Persians suffered greatly from this war. The population dropped by around 2 million and cost them around $300 billion. The Khomeini promised any soldier who died in battle to be guaranteed paradise or al-Jannah. As a result, thousands would just walk in a straight line towards the Iraqis and die, just hoping to be rewarded with paradise. So it was a pretty bloody war. But anyhow, peace was brokered, and the supreme leader found himself in bad health by 1988. He ended up dying after a string of heart attacks, and the president, Sayyid Ali Husseini Khomeini, became his successor. So they both have very similar names, so it can be kind of confusing, Khomeini versus Khamenei, that's the same guy who's the supreme leader today. So now this brings us to Iran Air Flight 655. It was a scheduled passenger flight that was shot down on July 3rd of 1988 by the U.S. Navy. So the airplane was completely destroyed, and all 290 people on board, including 66 children, were killed. So this is definitely one of the darkest parts of American history that many people don't know about. But anyhow, in the Strait of Hormuz, it had become basically just a shooting range for international oil supertankers, and the U.S. was there to protect the tankers as they do today. But during this time period, it was during the Iran-Iraq war, so both the Persians and Iraqis were attacking the tankers traveling through the area, and when the plane was shot down, it was just a high tension time period. So, for example, the Iraqi Air Force had attacked the U.S. Navy guided missile frigate USS Stark on May 17th of 1987. It killed 37 American sailors. The U.S. naval forces also exchanged gunfire with Persian gunboats in late 1987, and the U.S. Navy guided missile frigate Samuel B. Roberts had struck a Persian sea mine in April of 1988. So, in addition, there was also Operation Praying Mantis, which resulted in the sinking of a Persian frigate, Sahand, and also sunk half the Persian Navy. So we are kind of essentially in a war at this period with Persia. And the USS Vincennes entered the Strait of Hormuz right after all this occurred. So it was a very highly technical, advanced missile-equipped ship in the U.S. Navy. So it was really not a good idea for the ship to be there in the first place because it's very high technology of the time period. Why risk it, right? And not to mention it was just a very busy area. So you have all this different chatter on the radio. Not to mention it's meant to be shooting down airplanes, not ships. So why is this missile-guided frigate, hanging around in the Strait of Hormuz? Not really a good idea, if you ask me. It's not going to end well. So Vincennes had made 10 attempts to contact the aircraft on both military and civilian radio frequencies, but they received no response. And the International Civil Aviation Organization said that the flight crew, they should have been monitoring the civilian frequency, which I'm not sure if they were or weren't, but they clearly weren't listening. According to the Persian government, of course, the cruiser was negligent, and they shot down the aircraft, which was transmitting IFF squawks in Mode 3, a signal that's identified as civilian, not Mode 2, which is used by Persian military aircraft. So they claim they were doing Mode 3, but that was yet to be found. The event generated a great deal of criticism by the U.S., of the U.S., of course. Some analysts blamed the captain of the Vincennes, William Rogers, for over-aggressive behavior in a tense and dangerous environment. Definitely. Not to mention he should have probably been jailed. Instead, he received a medal, which was completely dumb. In the days immediately following the incident, President Reagan issued a diplomatic note to the Persian government expressing deep regret. It's honestly one of the darkest moments of American history. By 1996, though, the governments of both the U.S. and Persia reached a settlement. The U.S. recognized it is a terrible human tragedy. We expressed deep regret over the lost, lives of the incident. And part of the settlement, we even agreed to pay $61.8 million on an ex gratia basis. So meaning per person, it was $213,103.45 per passenger in compensation to the families of the Persian victims. But however, we did not apologize, which is important to note. We only did apologize when Reagan apologized, so that was basically it. We kind of washed any legal liability from the matter. Anyhow, it's the deadliest aviation disaster to occur in Persia. This was definitely the low point of our relations, even worse than what it is today. So now this just brings us to the nuclear program of Persia. Overall, when it comes to nuclear programs regarding sovereign nations, the first thing to realize, yes, all people deserve to have nuclear power with the ability of clean, renewable energy. Persia's nuclear program was originally launched in the 1950s with the help of the U.S. as part of the Atoms for Peace program that was created by Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Atoms for Peace, it was basically just this program and just speech by Eisenhower. It just aimed to create a peaceful world through the spread of nuclear information in hopes that some countries could use the technology for energy while others can use it to prevent atomic warfare. Regulations were basically created to stop other countries from developing weapons while also allowing the technology to be used for positive means. So it formed the ideological background for the creation of the International Atomic Agency, or IAEA, which is known as today, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, but also gave a political cover for the U.S. nuclear weapons buildup and the backdrop to the Cold War arms race. Under programs related to Atoms for Peace, the U.S. exported over 25 tons of highly enriched uranium, or HEU, to 30 countries, mostly to fuel research reactors, and is now regarded as a proliferation and terrorism risk. But anyhow, later around 191 countries have signed the landmark Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970, which was basically started from the Atoms for Peace. So later, you have this big non-proliferation treaty that was signed, and to this day, Persia is actually a member. But the list of the states who are not include North Korea, Israel, Pakistan, India, and South Sudan. So in 1970, Persia ratified the NPT, making its nuclear program subject to IAEA's verification process and searches. The International Atomic Energy Agency, again, it's just an international organization that seeks to promote peaceful use of nuclear energy and to inhibit its use for military purpose, including nuclear weapons, of course. It was established as an autonomous organization on July 29th, 1957, and it's headquartered in Vienna, Austria. So in 1973, France, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, they formed the joint stock company called Eurodif. So this is actually really important. People don't know about this. Sweden actually withdrew from the project in 1974. But in 1975, Sweden's 10% share in Eurodif was transferred to Persia as a result of an arrangement between France and Persia. So the French government subsidiary company is called Cogema, and the Persian government established the company called Solidif. So it's like Société Franco-Iranienne pour Union. It's something in French. It's an acronym. Sofidif. Just remember that word. Enterprise with it was basically with 60% and 40% shares, 60% being French, 40% being Persian, respectively. So in turn, Solidif acquired 25% share in Eurodif, though, which Iran attained its 10% share of Eurodif. So just know that Persia owns 10% of Eurodif moving forward. So in 1974, the Shah Mohammad Reza, he lent $1 billion and another $180 million in 1977 for the construction of a Eurodif enrichment factory. So when I say enrichment, I mean uranium enrichment. So this is used for military weapons. This is also used for just nuclear power. Anyhow, he wanted to have a right to buy 10% of the uranium, the enriched uranium that is produced from the factory. So the factory was named after a guy named Georges Besse. It was the founder and president. And basically, it provides uranium to 40 different producers of nuclear energy, including EDF. So EDF, if you ever heard of them, it's France's largest electric power company. In 2009, EDF was the largest electricity provider in the world. And in 2011, it provided 22% of the EU's electricity. So 64% of their electricity was provided by nuclear power, which in turn is provided by Eurodiff. So it's worth considering that whenever the EU or France switches on a light or uses electricity, Persia has provided some of the uranium to fuel that. So anytime that, if you think about it, 64% of the electricity, 10% is from Eurodiff. Well, no, 10% is from Persia. That's a big thing to point out. So subsequently, after the 1979 revolution, most of the international nuclear cooperation was cut off with Persia under the direction of the U.S., including revenues from Sofadiff via Eurodiff. So in 1981, Persian officials decided to press on with their nuclear program and continue the idea to have nuclear power and weapons. So during the Iran-Iraq War, the Persians sped up their development, and they were trying to develop weapons of mass destruction, but the Iraqis actually bombed their facilities. And due to France cutting off the payments to Persia via Sofadiff, the Persians began a blackmail campaign against the French. So in 1985, they took French hostages in Lebanon. In 1986, Eurodiff's former president, Georges Bess, the guy that the factory was named after and the president at the time, now he was working for a different company, but the man, he was assassinated. So as a result, the French capitulated to the Persian wants of their revenues. So on May 6, 1988, French Premier Jacques Chirac, he signed an accord with Persia. France agreed to accept Persia back into its shareholder status of Eurodiff and deliver its enriched uranium without restrictions. So in exchange for the hostages, and during this 10-year crisis, Persia acquired various nuclear installations, reactors, equipment to enrich uranium, etc., from states such as Germany, Argentina, China, and Pakistan. So from 1987 to 88, the Argentinians actually went through the same kind of bullying that France did. They signed an agreement with Persia to help convert the reactor from highly enriched uranium fuel from 19.75, so that's close to medium enriched, which is 20%, to low enriched uranium. So low enriched uranium is used for civilian means and power. Highly enriched uranium is up to, let's say, 90%. That's considered weapons grade. So like France, like I said, during the late 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. pressured Argentina to terminate its nuclear cooperation with Persia, and from 1992 to 1994, negotiations between Argentina and Persia took place with the aim of reestablishing three agreements that they made in 1987 and 1988. So some have linked the attacks, such as the 1992 attack on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and the AMIA building that was bombed. It was the largest terror attack in Argentinian history. This was basically part of another blackmail campaign by the Persians to pressure Argentina into honoring the agreement. So ultimately, like the French, the Argentinians folded and the uranium was delivered in 1993. So along the way, during the 1990s, the Russians, of course, provided the Persians with nuclear experts and technical information. So by January of 1995, Russia actually signed a nuclear cooperation treaty with Iran concerning, in particular, to the Bushehr nuclear power facility. So 2 years later, France signed an accord to deliver enriched uranium to Russia, while the Russian cooperation with Persia was being enforced. So by the 2000s, it seemed that the low enriched uranium was developing highly enriched programs. Apparently, Persia had some clandestine uranium enrichment programs, according to Persian dissidents. So this, of course, brought again the fear of non-peaceful uses by the Persians against regulations of 1985 that they signed. So the IAEA launched an investigation in 2003 as a result. So if you recall 2003, that's the invasion of Iraq. Elements of the Persian government made a confidential proposal for a quote-unquote a grand bargain through Swiss channels. It offered full transparency of Persia's nuclear program and withdrawal of support of Hamas and Hezbollah in exchange for security assurances from the United States and normalization of diplomatic relations. So basically, they were saying, don't invade us. The Bush administration did not respond to the proposal, as senior officials just doubted its authenticity, which, why could you believe the Persians at this point? The proposal was supposedly blessed by the Ayatollah Khamenei, but we'll see. And had this been true, it would have been great if the Bush administration at least looked into it. They definitely looked into it. They thought that it just wasn't feasible. So the U3 countries, or Germany, France, Great Britain, they try to capitalize on the concerns by the Persians of an American invasion, similar to Iraq. And as a result, Persia agreed to conditions of searches by IAEA, but after 3 years, it became apparent that Persia was being non-compliant with its obligations, and the United Nations Security Council demanded that Persia suspend its enrichment programs. So it turned out the Bush administration was correct in assessing that Persia would not hold true to their word and respect the deal. The EU3 were wrong. So over the course of 4 years, from 2006 to 2010, the UN Security Council had passed 8 resolutions on Persia, which demanded Persia suspend its uranium enrichment activities, impose sanctions after Persia refused to suspend its enrichment activities. It required Persia to cooperate with IAEA. It imposed a complete arms embargo on Persia. It banned Persia from any activities relating to ballistic missiles, so that's the missiles that can carry nuclear warheads. It authorized the inspection and seizure of shipments violating these restrictions, and it extended the asset freeze of the Iranian Revolution Guards and the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines. So a lot of sanctions that were placed on from 2006 to 2010. In addition, there were already sanctions that were placed by Congress and the Clinton administration in the 1990s. So 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany had previously offered Persia a package of incentives just aimed at getting the country to restart negotiations. But Persia refused to halt its nuclear activities first. Kind of sounds like what's going on today. Incentives included offers to improve Persia's access to the international economy through participation of groups such as the World Trade Organization and to modernize its telecommunications industry. The incentives also mentioned the possibility of lifting restrictions on U.S. and European manufacturers wanting to export civil aircraft to Persia, which would be nice for airliners because they have some of the most dangerous airlines in the world, basically through all the different sanctions that they have to go through. So a lot of the little pieces of metal and specialized material that they need for commercial airlines, they just simply don't have access to. So unfortunately, Persia has declined these terms on the grounds that they still want to enrich uranium. So by November of 2011, IAEA reported credible evidence that Persia had been conducting experiments aimed at designing a nuclear bomb. So Obama and Clinton made it known by 2009 that they would not support Persian enrichment, but unfortunately those words would be meaningless once Kerry signed the Iran nuclear deal, and that would not be the case. So Persia's first nuclear power plant, the Bushehr 1 reactor, was completed with major assistance from the Russian government and officially opened in 2011. The Russian engineering contractor Atomagiraprom said that Bushehr nuclear power plant would reach full capacity by 2012. So they're still enriching, they're still creating these new plants, so it's not really looking good. As of 2015, Iran's nuclear program had cost $100 billion in lost oil revenues and lost foreign direct investment because of international sanctions. So around $500 billion when other opportunity costs were included. So this brings us to the overall just signing of the Iran nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action. It was signed in 2015 by China, U.S., Great Britain, France, Iran, Germany, and Russia. So Obama really wanted a deal to be signed to add on to his legacy. So as a result, he bypassed Congress. He reduced the ability for the DEA to arrest Hezbollah's drug dealers in order to placate Persia. It was called Project Cassandra. It was an operation launched in 2008 to curb Hezbollah's drug running activities in Europe. So again, Hezbollah was a paramilitary force in Lebanon, and they were generating a lot of their revenue through selling drugs. And they were financed and still financed by Persia. So, and finally, according to James Mattis, I actually just read this article today. Obama did nothing when a bomb plot was thwarted in Washington, D.C. at the popular restaurant Cafe Milau. So the cafe is typically full of politicians, such as ambassadors from around the world, and such as like Saudi Arabia. So as a result, 2 Persian nationals were arrested, and nothing else was done by Obama, since he didn't want to put the negotiations at risk. So it's definitely worth noting how he just pushed the deal through without considering Congress or these pretty bad acts by Persia. So anyhow, the summary of the deal is the following. This is going to be the basics, but I'm going to try to get in as much as I can. But after 15 years, all physical limits on enrichment will be removed, including the limits on the type and number of centrifuges. Persia's stockpile of enriched uranium, which will be reduced by 97%, where Persia may have enrichment facilities, but they can't build any new ones. After 10 years, Persia would place over 2/3 of its centrifuges in storage, with the enrichment capacity being limited to the Natanz plant. Persia may continue research and development work on enrichment only at the Natanz plant with older centrifuges, which is meant to delay the quote-unquote breakout time from 1 year or the time it takes to create a nuclear warhead. So usually it would take a year under the Iran nuclear deal, but currently they were sitting at around 2 to 3 months. So Persia was to modernize and rebuild the Iraq heavy water research reactor with help from the countries who signed, plus some others. All spent fuel was to be sent out of the country, including all excess heavy water. So basically they could sell all the heavy water and spent fuel to the international market based on international prices. So in exchange, Persia then would receive 130 tons of uranium in 2015. In late 2016, it would then be approved to receive 130 tons in 2017. So all this was going down. For 15 years, Persia would not engage or research on basically spent fuel reprocessing, so just repackaging all the stuff that they already used and to sell it internationally. And they couldn't build any additional heavy water reactors or accumulate heavy water for 15 years. So inspections would then happen in perpetuity as long as they were a member of the Non-Proliferation Agreement. So a number of IAEA inspectors assigned to Persia would then triple from 50 to 150 inspectors. UN sanctions against Persia and some EU sanctions would then terminate, and some would then also be suspended. So once sanctions were lifted, Persia would recover approximately 100 billion of its assets frozen in overseas banks. So this is the money that Trump always talks about, that we gave them cash in a plane. This was money that was part of the Shah's Persia pre-revolution. So 8 years into the agreement, before I move forward. So yeah, this was the money that we always talk about when they receive cash on a plane. And, I think it's a terrible idea just to give them all this money, considering that they're just the number one world sponsor of terror. So moving forward, 8 years in the agreement, EU sanctions would also be lifted against a number of Persian companies, and individuals and institutions such as the Revolutionary Guards. U.S. would cease application of its nuclear-related secondary sanctions. So, basically, if you did business as another country, so, for example, banks would do business with a bank that was owned by a Persian company. So it's it's secondary. So many banks have been fined as a result of doing business with Persia. So Sanctions related to ballistic missile technologies will remain for 8 years. Similar sanctions on conventional weapon sales to Persia would remain for 5 years. All U.S. sanctions against Persia related to alleged human rights abuses, missiles, support for terrorism would not be affected by the agreement and would remain in place. So if a company or a person was connected to funding a terror network, for example, they would still be in place. No new UN or EU nuclear-related sanctions or restrictive measures would be imposed. If Persia violates the agreement, any of the signers can invoke the snapback provision on which the sanctions could snap back into place. So there's a lot of meat there. So let's kind of just go back and break down what's good and what's not. It basically just backs down on what the UN Security Council resolutions had already signed from 2006 to 2010. It demanded that Persia suspend its uranium. Well, again, I'm trying to refresh what the UN Security Council wanted to do in 06 through 10. They demanded that Persia suspend its uranium enrichment activities. The deal was not going to do that. It imposed sanctions after Persia refused to suspend its enrichment activities. It's removing sanctions. It imposed a complete arms embargo on Persia. It's not doing that. It banned Persia from any activities relating to ballistic missiles. The Iran nuclear deal was not doing that. However, the UN Security Council, for some reason, approved the deal anyway, which I don't understand. Just considering how the Persians were feeling the pressure economically throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, it seemed they would come to the table and actually agree to not enrich uranium. But we fell flat on that, and we unfroze our assets. After 15 years, Persia can do whatever it wants, albeit while being monitored by IAEA. But still, Trump is correct in asserting that the deal was a bad deal overall. We unfroze their assets that they were essentially stealing from the previous regime anyway, to the tune of $100 billion. Didn't mitigate the probability of acquiring nuclear warheads. It only kicks the can down the road for our kids and for me, people our age, anyone that will be alive by 2030. They assume that politicians that were involved in the 1979 revolution would not be in power by 2030, but that may be the case, but they still possess influence over those who are in power. Trump is doing a good job, of returning the sanctions that were placed on Persia during the Clinton years, the Bush years, and the Obama years. We need to keep up the pressure and add if they keep doing the things that they're doing in the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf of Oman, attacking ships, mining ships, trying to seize ships. I just saw that 12 Filipino sailors were seized in a tugboat the other day. Persian oil experts have just completely dwindled since implementation of sanctions. They're working. Perhaps we can use their desire to improve their economy and exports to just renegotiate a better deal where they cannot highly enrich uranium in perpetuity. They simply just can't be trusted the way that they're acting as a country. They've been a menace to the world scene the past 6 months, as we can see what's been going on. They shot down one of our drones as well, which cost millions of dollars, and they tried to capture that British ship. And they also are trying to sell oil to Syria, which is against EU sanctions. They just need to be dealt with. The same sanctions should remain, and if they try any funny stuff, there should be greater sanctions imposed on their banking, their oil, even their pistachios. I guess that's one of their big exports. Everything that generates their income. But, anything that's humanitarian, such as medicine, they should remain unsanctioned. This could be where Trump is able to make gains with the Persian people, where he offers banking institutions worldwide the ability to do business with Persia. Thereby, he just allows prices for drugs and medicines to go down. Apparently, that's a big problem right now where cancer patients and different kinds of people with chronic illnesses, they can't get their medicines because it's so expensive because banks, all the transactional fees to go around the back channels, it just makes the cost an exorbitant price. So if you recall too in the news, Macron from France He offered a credit line of $15 billion to the Persians to keep the nuclear deal alive. So consider how the Persians have 10% stockholding in Eurodiff, and a good amount of their electricity is generated through their nuclear plants. Macron isn't saying it, but the French somewhat rely on the Persians in regards to the uranium enrichment and electricity. So I'm not surprised that Macron is trying to broker a deal, considering that they get a portion of their electricity through a Persian company. So in addition, though, China, they've been working on a large investment into Persian oil that was announced last week. They're investing $280 billion into Persia's oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors that are affected by U.S. sanctions. So many on the left are just criticizing Trump, saying, this is why you don't unilaterally leave deals, etc. But these deals, these talks, they started in 2016. So regardless of what Trump was going to do, the Chinese wanted to invest in Persia. And if they want to invest in a sanctioned product, then by all means, go do it. The agreement between the Persians and Chinese, it's pretty important, though, because it permits China to purchase oil, gas, and petrochemical products at low prices, and they reserve the right to delay the payment of these prices for 2 years in the Chinese national currency, or the yuan. So basically, they can defer their payment and then basically make profit through its projects in Africa and former Soviet republics, and then not do these transactions with USD. So make the profit in their own currency, then pay them later on. So that's actually very important, so that they don't have to use USD. USD is the typical transactional currency for any petrol in the world, so any oil. Very important. So according to the source, though, this agreement grants China a discount of around 32% on all oil, gas, and petrochemical products from Persia. So this plan emerged during the course of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. It's basically where they want to create the Silk Road again. Beijing intends to take advantage of the low-cost labor force, basically, that's available in Persia. They want to establish factories to be supervised by Chinese prominent companies. In return, the new agreement enables Tehran to strengthen its partnership with Beijing, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So, then they'll get China to vote as they want to vote, right? So it raises the level of production in 3 of the largest oil and gas fields, in addition to China's approval to increase the volume of oil imports from Persia. So, haven't we heard this story before? With the Seven Sisters back with BP. I don't think this will end well with China. I think if it does, then, well, if they think that it will, they certainly haven't read their history. This is just one of those reasons why, Persia might not care about China placing Muslims in concentration camps. I think they already know what they want to do later, not pay them back, similar to what they did to BP, Exxon, and Chevron. So, we'll see what happens in the future, but I just know, you can't trust the Persians when it comes to investing in their oil or their petrochemicals. So in the end, though, I really want Persia to be the Persia that was around in the 1970s. Of course, being pro-Western, but still, it was very good for their population as a whole. Yeah, sure, the Shah was brutally oppressing some people, but overall, their economy was doing very well. The middle class was growing. They were supposed to be a first world nation by the next decade or two. And now they've just dropped off because of all these sanctions, because they've been kind of acting a little crazy with foreign policy. But albeit we did affect, who was in power in the 20th century. We kind of meddled in their business. But we did show them how to, refine oil, where to get the oil. They didn't even know where it was. We had to give them all the investment and the infrastructure to get there. They didn't have any of that to begin with. And, the British and the Americans, they basically showed them the way. And albeit we did kind of take advantage of the situation, but overall, that might happen to China too. So, as we just move forward, I would like to see their oil, on the world market so they can do well themselves and enrich their own country. But, it's just tough to say or at least advocate for when they chant death to America on the regular. If they're willing to deal with Trump, Trump should consider relaxing sanctions to help the Persian people, namely with medicines. So, sometimes you need to attract the flies with honey, not vinegar, but hopefully Trump can basically help them with their medicines and, maybe open up some avenues for them to lower their medicinal prices, and maybe they'll be more prone to making a better deal, because most of the people that were polled in Persia, they preferred having a nuclear program, but they did not prefer to have a nuclear program that hurt their economy. They'd rather put their economy first. So, okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed my video, and I'll see you on the next one.